And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to be here with everyone. It's an excellent crowd already. And, you know, a lot of incredible questions are coming out of that chat today. So we just have an incredible brain trust. And that's one of the fantastic things about doing this show is all the people who come in to share these great ideas. And tonight we're going to do something particularly special. And this is a show I've been planning on for a while, which really goes into the more indigenous traditions relating to the mystery of the X Steganography and the mystery schools and some of these larger truths that we've tracked through history all the way up to the present. And of course, as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we're going to focus tonight on the Dogon Tribe in Mali, in Africa. And they're of particular interest to me because I've been tracking their story for a number of years. There have been some very good books, which we'll draw on for them. But I'm going to actually bring in some aspects that have never been brought forward before relating to the Dogon. And at the end of my research of looking into this so far, I'm actually surprised that some of these aspects have never been brought in because they're so glaringly obvious when you put the traditions together. And that's something that we're doing here with the X series, which is very often one aspect of the mystery schools, one aspect of these esoteric teachings exists kind of autonomously in a void, and it's interpreted and reinterpreted. And, you know, you'll have people who go very deep into the Buddhist side or people who are very into the Sufi side. And we have all these various edges to it, which is great. And people should really be super focused on them. That thread, that larger thread that we've seen in the work of people like Aldous Huxley talking about the perennial philosophy, or Joseph Campbell with the hero with 1,000 faces, there is a recurring pattern that occurs. The Golden Bow was certainly one of the great books that did this, tied in these legends in the very beginning. That book's about maybe 1910, somewhere in there. So, you know, it's very early trying to gather these legends together. There's another one by Ignatius Donnelly called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, where he really goes into those stories that relate on a native level. And it's a 19th century book. And so what we're getting is still kind of unfiltered before the real hammer came down at later times. So tonight, with episode 29 of the X series, we're going to look at the shamanistic element that enters when you start to approach the X Steganography seriously. You have to deal with it because the root of that mystical experience is the very heart of how we get these traditions in the first place. Going all the way back to antediluvian times, to the records of Atlantis, to the early Egyptian periods. And when we get that, when we actually have that in mind, it's much easier to see how it plays out. And then when we start to talk about things like psychic experience or deeper insights of the mind, or things like even psychic astrology or psychic archaeology, they make a lot more sense because we have a whole tradition of how it's done. And although it's been lost, you know, more recently, say in the past 400 years of civilization, we're looking at a period of a kind of a reboot. It's the opportunity to retake a lot of these topics and understand them in a deeper way. And the thing is, this was all set up for us by the mystery schools in the 19th century and early 20th century. And you can find that in so many of the episodes that we've done relating to groups like Theosophy or Anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science movement. And Steiner comes up a few times tonight as well, as does Edgar Cayce. So you can see how these traditions are really kind of giving us carte blanche to find out these deeper realities and what the deeper truth is relating to a lot of these spiritual, psychospiritual principles. And what we get very often in the fields dealing with these kinds of principles is a lot of marketing and a lot of intelligence manipulation, let's say. So in order to avoid that, we do something which is everything that we come out with is so fact supported. That is, you know, when I say something and come out with a story relating to, for example, Henry Wallace being set up to be the first theosophical president of the United States, it might sound like a wild claim. But very slowly and carefully, I've put out the shows and the records dealing with that, because Henry Wallace, of course, was a member of the Halcyon Temple in California, which was a major theosophical center that Annie Besant set up with the father of the Varian brothers. So although these, it's very important, I think, and where we get away from that when we have a lot of things dealing with things on the esoteric side, whether it's New Age, the UFO file, all these different areas are so consciously manipulated by the establishment that they just don't want you looking into those things. They especially don't want you looking into it if they have a hand in it, because they're looking into it themselves and they don't want the public to muck that all up or understand it. So we're really representing here a very contrary movement to the pressure of the establishment, and it's more and more limited focus and more limited output. Let's say, they have a one-channel idea of everything, and it's the scientific materialism that was warned about by Rudolf Steiner, who was the leader of anthroposophy. And this is a very important crux for the X series, so I never get tired of bringing it up. But his basic premise that in 1840, with scientific materialism closing in, there was a move by these groups that held secret knowledge in the underground. These mystery schools operated in such a way that they just were undetectable over time. And they had hit a point where, foreseeing the future, we were going to kind of move into this dark age of the 20th century from their vantage point, looking at it in 1840 with the advent of scientific materialism. They basically went for broke, and they decided we cannot allow this situation to go on, because the scientific materialism will limit their views down even further and further. So if they may have been dominated by religious dogma coming into this period, now science is going to be the new religion that's going to crush them completely. And in 100 years, no one's even going to recognize humanity. So we have to get these secrets out now. The problem was, a lot of those groups were really good at holding on to the secrets, and that's all they knew how to do. So the idea of revealing them to a larger populace was absurd. And you can see in a lot of the occult, mystery school wars of the late 19th century, it's pretty wild. They try a few times to put the genie back in the bottle, but it's not going to happen. And I think you get to a point when you look at theosophy setting up anthroposophy, and anthroposophy setting up the Western esoteric tradition, and really kind of fulfilling a number of mandates for those mystery schools, coming forward with crucial information relating to things we discuss in this program, like Ahriman and the Eighth Sphere. Now that that information got into the public domain, now we've had 100 years of digesting it. What did the public do with it? How is it absorbed? And there were great renaissance. That occurred of ideas. People talking openly in Western society about reincarnation, psychic experience, near-death experience. It worked. It certainly worked. But it got so manipulated and marketed and all these things that we don't know, in a way, who we're dealing with when we go to look into a topic. So it's very important that the X Steganography is something that helps to guide us to figure out who's doing what, because the X Steganography represents a kind of code. And what's really odd is that, here we are discussing these mystery school principles, the esoteric principles, and these native traditions holding these principles, like the Dogon, and like these other groups, the Yezidis, who we're also going to talk about tonight. But here we are looking at it, and the X Steganography, I originally tripped into it when I was doing basically investigative reporting on government secrecy, and that's where it kept showing up the most. And if you go through the episodes that we've done here relating to the X and how they use it, it's a kind of signifier. It's how they move projects forward. It's how they do, very advanced technology projects, and only keep a few people in the loop, while naming things that seem perfectly normal to us on the surface, like the X-15 or things like that. We come into a whole different type of nomenclature, a naming study. When we're able to apply the X Steganography to it, it opens up the same way the Rosetta Stone opened up hieroglyphs in Egypt, because when they found the Rosetta Stone, it's my favorite example, it was also there written in Aramaic and in Greek, or Coptic and in Greek. So they were able to literally take those pictures that were hanging out there that no one knew anything about and just wondered about, and put them together, because they realized this is the same text in 3 different languages. That was the key to how we understand Egypt today. Well, you know, that happened in the era of Napoleon. So when you really look at it that way, we're just coming to some of these answers now about the nature of our world. Before that, we didn't know anything about Egypt. And I got to say, I still don't think we know a whole heck of a lot. As a matter of fact, the dynasties that were figured out are largely a product of that 17th, 18th, 19th century. You know, I mean, we have all sorts of new tools now. All of that dating should be thrown out, and more of the dating of people like Graham Hancock or John Anthony West, Robert Bauval. They created a much better standard. Robert Schoch, you know, we've got much more details from them that tell us we need a new model of how we look at our ancient past. So how do we get to that new model? In my opinion, it's the native cultures that have held the truth, and they've been persecuted. But a few kind of escaped, and they escaped the persecution and got away on their own. And we're going to talk about them tonight as we go. And before we break into everything, I'm going to check with Olivia on everyone out there how the questions go.
Would you like to field the question right away?
Absolutely.
Okay, we get this one a lot. Zach Gerard wants to know, where are the mystery schools now? And Jay Mallet wants to know, why is the Western esoteric tradition different from the Eastern esoteric tradition?
Oh, yeah. Those are 2 great questions. The mystery schools come forward at different times. They came forward drastically in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century, setting up people like Steiner, setting up people like Blavatsky. And also having a hand in setting up some of the most well-known psychics like Edgar Cayce. But what happens is they back off and they kind of see what we do with the information, and they come forward again. So if you try to physically locate a mystery school, it's going to be pretty interesting. But you're going to find them in America. You're going to find them in Egypt. You're going to find them all across Europe, and also in the heart of Asia. So the people that came forward to tell us about them for our modern era and kind of lay down the platform, like Gurdjieff, like Steiner. You know, the Gurdjieff schools, the ones that the Sarmoon Brotherhoods and the ones that he was encountering, those schools were in Iran, they were in Turkestan, they were in Armenia. So what was happening was there was some kind of pipeline between those schools in that era, in that period, and the intelligentsia in Russia. And, you know, some of the people who came forward around Gurdjieff's work were Russian philosophers like P.D. Ouspensky, who really, we wouldn't really know much about the Gurdjieff work without him. He's really the key figure in all of it. And so that gives us a hint, maybe a hint, but we can see the mystery school is very active in the formation of America and the American Revolution. So yeah, it is fascinating. And so they certainly have made that impact at times. And, you know, there was a point at which J.G. Bennett, who's a student of Gurdjieff, got these questions about, well, with all the stuff that Gurdjieff put out, like, why hasn't it transformed the world and all this, you know, why isn't Gurdjieff a household name? And Bennett said, well, I asked Gurdjieff about the spread of these mystery teachings and how the schools regarded it. And the schools, from his point of view, are not meant to be institutions. What they do is they come out and they spread seeds, and then they go back about their business, and those seeds sprout out and help influence and develop the culture, which is a little bit different. You know, in a way, the system now, the economic system, the corporate elite system that we live under does just the opposite. They try to do the same thing and influence the culture, but they want to influence it to harvest it. So they're working at cross purposes with something like the mystery school, which is trying to move the culture forward. So 2 very, very diverse tensions that we're looking at there. In terms of Eastern versus Western mystery schools, the Eastern mystery schools have long held the major influence. They set up this period that we're in for the Western mystery schools, which is why there's a split with anthroposophy and theosophy, because theosophy wanted to go back to the Eastern teaching and say, well, look, we had Zen, we had this meditation, we had this peaceful idea. Let's just teach Buddhism again. And the Western tradition, the true Western esoteric tradition, has a different role, and it needs to fulfill its role so that the entire evolutionary stream of spiritual development and growth can be fully absorbed. And so the Eastern part, we should have an appreciation for what that Eastern part, I mean, think about theosophy and its influence on the culture now. It's amazing. Even now we see people walking around with yoga mats and stuff. I mean, that's theosophy, which brought all of that over here: yoga, meditation, cremation, even reincarnation. I mean, this all came through the work of Helena Blavatsky. And then we get Steiner's work. He was the head of the German Theosophical chapter. So we have to understand the foundation. I think then we get a better picture. But certainly Eastern and Western traditions, they both, aspire to move humanity to a higher place. I mean, that's their nature, the nature of what they do for evolution. However, in terms of timing, each has a role to play at different times, and the move now has to be on the Western esoteric side. That's where the heart of it all is. So yeah, fantastic questions already. I can see everyone's on board.
Can I ask you a follow-up?
Yeah.
Okay, so BV wants to know,
BV?
Mystery schools, what do you think of seeking out modern Masons or Rosicrucians? Should we just seek info solo versus joining an organization?
Well, I've talked about this, I guess it was in the Ada Lovelace episode. So there are levels to mystery schools. The real hardcore actual mystery school is very inaccessible to the public just by its nature. It's so highly secretive. But there are sort of levels and rings around it. The lesser, what they call the lesser schools, the lesser traditions, I always say excuse the name, because they're certainly incredibly evolved teachings. But you hear more about those. And then, we have deeper aspects like the arcane schools, which literally just keep the knowledge and they go by the book, basically. It's kind of a book tradition, but they know deep, deep secrets, which just aren't public. But most of what we get when we hear about, a Rosicrucian group or a Masonic group that's around, we're getting the outer ring, what I call private study group. That's a particular level under the arcane, under the lesser, and under the main mystery schools. And then underneath that is the public inquiry. That's a public group, a public study group. Just to simplify it, those are really the levels. So sometimes you go from public to private study group, and in that ring is pretty much all the groups that you're talking about. So there have been people who've written to me and said, I think I was part of a mystery school. And I just tell them, no, you weren't part of a mystery school. You'd know it. They change your life forever if you're in a mystery school. But if you were in a group studying mystery traditions, then they could make a big impact on you for sure. Probably a private study group, which I've been involved with them and studied them and spent time with people in them for years, trying to get information that you can't get just from the books. So it is a good...
There are such great questions tonight. We're never even going to get to the show.
Okay, well, you can...
Let me ask you one more
Sure.
as a follow-up. Okay, so Free the Butterflies wants to know,
Great
are
name.
CIA agents part of mystery schools?
Well, how the deep state relates to the mystery schools, I often say the deep state is a symptom of the war between the mystery schools. So the answer is definitely yes. But we have to understand that the mystery schools are predominantly benevolent in terms of their impact on the culture. There are outfits that are called, basically, they call them left-hand groups, and they operate with the mystery traditions. I wouldn't call them true mystery schools, but nonetheless, they're all in that tradition. When they have the same level of knowledge, they kind of go by that same moniker. But there's no question that there are deeper levels, even when you hear about the secret societies who are on the darker edge of things, on the more occult side. You know, they're looking for domination from a black arts a point of view, from a point of perspective. You know, we get into a situation where they use a lot of the same techniques, but they're coming from a completely different place. So that's where you get the intelligence connections. That's where you get that whole elite fascination with the black arts.
Yeah, is it John Alexander comes to mind, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah. Okay, I have one last question about mystery schools, which is going to lead into the episode. Okay, so Titan Blooded wants to know, did Dogon knowledge originate in Egyptian mystery schools?
Well, you know, you're gonna go at that's the end of my presentation. So you jumped the gun a little bit, but okay. It's good. No, it's fantastic. And let's get right into the Dogon. This is going to be one of the greatest things in the world. First of all, what I want to say about the Dogon is, Robert Temple's book, The Serious Mystery, it did them a service in one sense. And it's a terrific book. It gives you a real outline of where the tradition of the Dogon came from. But it brings in a ET hypothesis, which is pretty easy to do when you're dealing with the Dogon, because their whole entire origin story relates to a group coming here from Sirius and, you know, spreading culture and this whole interaction that they have. And we're going to go through that tonight. We're going to go through the Nomu, and we're going to get a huge preview of who they are and how the Dogon have kept their tradition. And also how the Dogon kept this incredible knowledge in astronomy, which is undeniably scientifically proven. So when someone says, you know, as I was looking at former critics like the late Carl Sagan, and he was like, well, you know, the Dogon could have been studying in Western astronomical schools. Well, that doesn't explain anything. The Dogon, in their discovery of Sirius B, it was in their legend, and C, which we now know is also scientific fact. So when we get into it from that perspective, the naysayers, the gods of science, the scientific materialism that Rudolf Steiner warned about, we can see it, the arrogance on its face. You know, they don't want, if they come into a situation where it changes their story of how things happened, then they just won't own up to it. They just either avoid it or try to discredit it, sometimes both. So I think that we need to look at it. We're in a new information age, and this is new information, new breakthroughs. So in terms of how the culture adopts it, I had this conversation with Graham Hancock, who comes up a few times tonight because, of course, our conversation about these ancient cultures, we did a couple of interviews, and we're going to have Graham back on for his new book release in 2019. But one of the things that he told me was, look, there is a kind of critical mass of information coming forward where scientists are forced to. Don't ever imagine that if you show the information proving that culture is much older than recorded history, then that they're just going to embrace you with open arms and say, welcome to the new paradigm. Yes. No, his idea was basically they're going to throw stones at you and try to get rid of you, which they tried to do to him when he was proving that Egypt and the pyramids and the Sphinx were so much older. And then when they got weather watering data from Robert Schoch, we all know what happened there. It was this huge split, and it still sits there today. You know, the Sphinx has all this weather watering from 10,000 BC, but they date it to 2000 BC. Doesn't make any sense. So what do? Though they have the key to the establishment, they have the key to the hierarchy, and here we are, we know the truth. So, you know, it's an uneasy balance. There's a kind of a schizophrenia afoot. But I think what happens when we study and when we work with something that's a key, like the X Steganography helps, because it goes across different centuries. It goes across different traditions. I'm going to show you tonight how it's in the very heart of the Dogon tradition. As a matter of fact, what they're looking for and what they're looking for the return of is the X star, the dog star. So we're going to go into this a little bit. I want to give you just a quick look at some interesting figures related to the Dogon. Keep in mind this rather large kind of cone here. These are fascinating guys. This is the original sketch brought forward in 1933 by French researchers, and we're going to go into them also. Marcel Griot, and they were talking to this blind priest of the Dogon named Octomali. And what he did was he showed them this graph. And let's see if we can get a good look at that. Basically, actually, Olivia, do you have my pen?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Gracias. I'll point this one out. Beautiful. Yeah, you know, this is Figgy, which is Sirius for them. Sirius B, and they knew with this little dot here that Sirius B was here, and this is Sirius A, the actual Sirius. Sirius is quite fascinating, but for them to have this kind of astronomical knowledge in 1933 when we didn't, and they had just been this culture that was discovered, you know, truly they had remained in this hill country and very hidden away from civilization. They were a lost tribe in essence, and their origins have always been obscured and are unusual. This is why they were able to keep the information and the tradition. Let's take a good look at what they were trying to get at. You know, I want to mention that the X rituals and the X traditions that they do when they do these incredible rituals, and I have incredible details of these rituals with some of the best pictures I think you'll see on it. But I want us to keep in mind that the Theosophical Society in the turn of the century, the early 20th century, Besant, Annie Besant, who was the leader of the Theosophical Society, and Colonel Olcott were doing these rituals in India with the same X's and with the same thrust, and the people who were participating knew, but the surrounding people didn't understand what the X ceremonies were all about. This is a picture in India of Annie Besant and Charles Olcott. Colonel Olcott is in deep trance there, deep trance, and this is where this takes you when you're a Dogon dancer also. So we're going to see the linking between the Theosophical Society and some of these deeper groups. I also want to point out, before we get into the whole actual ceremony, is the idea of the shaman and the idea of the altered states is kind of a crucial thing for us to get on board with right away, which is that all of these cultures, whether you're talking about cultures like the Hopi, or if you're dealing with the Maori, or you know, looking at the Dogon, if you're going into these different areas, you're going to find that the shaman tradition of the medicine man, of the wise woman, of someone who can go into that other world and pull back these realities, is the very root of what we have for psychic experience in the 21st century. So we need to understand that when they enter those altered states, they're doing it, they're trained from early childhood in these cultures to be able to do it and to be able to access it. So it becomes a natural thing for that culture to embrace these qualities in the gifted people that they have in the tribe, who will bring forward that information. They're basically born for a purpose, which is just like someone is born into a community who's a great doctor, you know, or a great preacher or something, and really has that impact. It's the same thing with the shamans. Now, principally, what's interesting is in my study, through a lot of Eliade's work on shamanism, is that it is actually the female shaman, because in the traditions, she has the lunar power with her. She's the one that they often turn to. So they kind of defer in true shamanistic traditions to the female shaman. So the female shaman coming into these realities, engaging with these realities, is, in a sense, although we all have these capabilities, they have the ability of, in the cultures, using that lunar connection by nature. And it's something that where, you know, the males of the tribe, and, you know, when we come forward as men accessing these truths, I have to say it really in plain speaking, we have to try a little harder, because that whole thing about female intuition and all the rest of it, you know, women naturally have a stronger bond with that psychic reality. And, you know, whether they choose to engage with it is a totally different matter. But the female shaman is something that you're going to find is a real hardcore root when you look at these traditions. And in Mexico, that's a passed down tradition when you're going for groups like the Mayans, and they trade that knowledge. You know, very often you hear about these traditions among the Maya where the older men had traded all the wisdom down to the younger men using the crystal skull and stuff like that. I found legends relating to that crystal skull where it was actually a woman transferring, it was the female shaman transferring it down to the oncoming female shaman. So certainly they had both, you know, there's no question about it. But I think that we don't quite, you know, we need to, if we get our hands on the idea that the female shaman is the natural heir to these abilities, we'll get a better handle right away on what we're looking at. Later, we get into traditions like, you know, popularly known as the gypsies and all this kind of fortune telling and all these psychic powers. Well, what are we really talking about with somebody like the gypsies? You know, they have this natural ability. That group, identified this way, had this incredible ability to see people's future and all the rest of it. So there is that classic kind of gypsy female archetype. So these things I think we should keep in mind, especially because of our work around the Orphic Circle and the discovery there that Emma Britton brought forward, that we've done on a number of shows relating to how this really kind of high society UK prime ministers and all these types of people in the 19th century used these incredibly gifted somnambulist female shamans, for want of a better word. And Emma Britton was one of the best. So I think that gives us maybe a little bit of a road to pick up on. Let's look at the Dogon Rituals, now that I think we have some idea. Olivia, you, of course, have a great interest in shamanistic work. Before we get into this, with everything I just said, is there anything you want to add on the
No, I'll just add as we go along.
Okay. But certainly that entire tradition, I would say, the Native woman tradition, you've seen it up close. So
yeah, I've done a lot of work around that.
Yeah. And
a lot of different modalities.
It's something, you know, it's something very worthwhile, I think, looking at those native traditions. It's incredibly eye-opening because by the nature of the culture, it's not even any fault of ours, but we're so much more engaged with the day-to-day activities in a culture like the one that we're in, that the kind of larger reality gets missed, whereas those cultures were looking for that larger reality on a more kind of consistent, let's say, consistent level. All right, so the Dogon and who they're looking for. Let's look at something that will help us understand what the Dogon ritual is all about, because we're going to focus in on the ritual and who they're trying to engage with it and how that relates to their history. And I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalist. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. That is really the way that we stay in touch. You know how it is with the nature of, on Twitter recently, they just banned searches, or on half of the users were sending me all these pictures of, if you search for Dark Journalists, they would say, we can't show you this sensitive content. Well, I guess if the X series, I'm bringing out all the sensitive content. What do you think?
Yeah, the other thing is, if you just make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, because they have a practice of unsubscribing our subscribers to keep our numbers low. So please remember to do that and hit the bell for notifications.
Well, there is that block in place. But, you know, we've done astonishingly well because we have something close to 2.5 million views for the X series, which is remarkable. You know, I mean, this isn't the water skiing cat or something. I mean, it's, you know, it is really deep material, and that type of support and that type of curiosity is the kind of thing that keeps us very excited about the work that we're doing. So, but being at darkjournalist.com and signing up for the newsletter means that you're going to be in the pipeline, that once a week we're going to send you your newsletter. Probably many of you are here tonight because of the newsletter. And you'll know who's going to be coming on the show. We have a number of guests coming up for August. You're going to need that information. So make sure that you're subscribed there. And, basically all that will happen is you'll get an email once a week telling you what shows are coming down. And I want to remind everyone also that next week we are doing the 2-part episode for the 30th episode of the X series. And we're going to be doing it on Friday night at the usual time at 7 p.m. But then Saturday, we're coming back with another show, 6 p.m. And also next Friday, Gigi Young will be joining us. And that's going to be amazing.
Next week's going to be incredible.
I have some stuff there, which tonight is really, it all works as one big chain. Because the breakthrough that we have tonight is going to set off a lot of bells. And then by next week, it's going to be a full-scale fire. All right. Let's go to something that Gurdjieff said in Search of the Miraculous. When Ouspensky was pressing him about why he was doing all of these temple dance groups and assembling all these groups to do kind of whirling dervish style dance and sacred movement. And Gurdjieff said, well, the first thing really that you learn in the schools is an alphabet of movement, so that when you do a certain move, you are communicating a verb, a sentence, a place. You can actually, there's an alphabet to these movements, and those who know how to read them, a la steganography, when they watch the dance, they can read many books in a ceremony that goes on, say, for a couple of days, like the Dogon ceremonies do. So they're sitting there watching and reading the books, reenacting, very much almost like a Shakespeare play. So if we understand that, and then we start to look at their movements and what they're actually engaged in, it'll give us a much better idea of what those ceremonies are about. And we track it very closely. These X movements are part of eurythmy and the mystery plays that Rudolf Steiner put on. And these movements had their significance for those who understood the X Steganography. I like to bring in that idea and the identity of the dance aspect. And I've shown the Gurdjieff ones before. That's a Steiner dancer dancing the movement of these stories. Now, the Dogon, in Robert Temple's book, like I said, they bring in this big ET identity to bring forward the information. And a number of people will say when dealing with the Dogon, and I can appreciate it, this is an ET story. But what I want to do is understand the mystery aspect first and the culture aspect of the antediluvian side, so that anything relating to the ET side can be understood or assimilated better. Very often, here's what you get, and here's the kind of dumbing down on the ancient alien side, which is, oh, look, there's a figure wearing a helmet. It must be an astronaut's helmet. That means they had space flight and aliens came and built everything. To primitive humans, they tweaked their DNA and made them a little bit better genetically. And I'll just keep seeing that every time I look at any story. So while I understand people reaching for those types of conclusions, the majority of the time they're totally wrong. And this is a tricky thing. The ancient culture that was advanced explains most of what people attribute to an ET off-planet factor in the past. And I can prove it. So a lot of that is prepackaged formulaic, and we have to really smash through that, even with good people, even with Robert Temple. We got to smash through the ETs did everything in the past, and that's how everything happened. It's not true. But I would say that we also have to acknowledge that larger off-planet reality and their interaction with the culture. I think that if we take it from a level that they interacted as peers who were more advanced, let's say us visiting a culture like New Guinea, in the early 20th century, we would have seemed like Supermen. Sure, but still, when you came right down to it, they were human, we were human. You know, so when you're engaged in this physical reality, I do feel that it's important to understand the peer aspect when relating to off-world civilizations. That takes some of the, you know, glitter off the UFO file too. It helps us to get more to what it is. We see very often people trying to be kind of save me, and the ETs are coming in to save the planet. Don't worry about it. I think that approach is wrong-headed because it misses the entire huge technological advancement of the Atlantean culture, which really set the tone for everything else. And it does record those interactions with off-world civilizations, no doubt about it. But we can understand them much better if we understand what we had in the first place. So let's take it. Let's start with that. So let's look at the Dogon Ritual and its X aspects first. This is the setup for the Sigi, which is the ritual that happens every 60 years by the Dogon in Mali, who, by the way, are an extraordinary culture. And I think to just look at them as some oddity of some group trying to call down aliens, which they've been portrayed a lot in the alternative media, it's a really bad way to look at them. What they are is a cultural repository of incredible mystery knowledge. So we're going to get a lot further if we understand who they are. The first thing you may have noticed is this incredible totem that extends so far above them that most of the time it's larger, much larger than the person who is actually dancing. Let's take a look at it in full. There's more of it here. That is a massive key, actually, to the ritual. And in a traditional fashion, anthropologists and all the rest of it say, oh, they're representing their family, you know. But that's not what the Dogon say, interestingly enough. And I'm going to share some of their insights here. The ritual is surrounded by X imagery because they are referring directly to the X Apotheum event and what they are going to be holding over from this great disaster that hit mankind and humanity over the course of 100,000 years, but the last major shakeout about 12,000 years ago. In the ritual masks, they are X's all over the ritual masks, traditional X's signifying the X Steganography of the mystery tradition. The face masks worn during the ritual carry the X directly, and it is very often the ritual dancers in this who get worked up into a frenzy because they're reenacting engaging with this incredible event, which relates directly to the X and why it's hidden through the mystery schools. One of the things you're going to notice, and this is one of the original pictures of what I'm going to refer to here as the X aspect of the ceremony. I think that the entire thing, like the Theosophical X ceremony, is very much the same. But here we see them on these incredible stilts. That shot is from 1933. So they had been keeping this ritual. They've done this ritual, of course, every 60 years. So they did it after this. But this was the original one that the researchers who first got their hands on meeting with them, and that's Marcel Griot in 1933. And he was working with the blind priest of the Dogon, who was giving them, really being incredibly open, and they developed an incredible dynamic between them. One of the things that happens, and you'll notice it, there are some good videos relating to the Dogon tribal dances, and you will notice a weird thing happens at one point when they're doing this dance, is that one of the dancers flips out and he moves his head in this incredible way that you can't even think of a human can do. And he takes that massive totem that's over his head and he slams it into the ground. This is a crucial moment. There's a picture of it here, and I really want to bring this up. Here he is. And, you know, just that incredible neck twist, which they must teach them from a very young age. This represents a massive event. And we're going to go into what their history describes it with, and I'm going to correlate it directly with the Atlantean disaster. Does that sound like a plan, Olivia?
Yeah. So is that the fact that he crashes it into the earth?
Yes.
Is that?
It is.
Okay.
It is. This is what sets up what we call the Apotheum effect. Now, Apotheum is something I bring up in this program because if you want to understand things about secrecy, then you have to understand what Apotheum is. Apotheum is just, in essence, when we hear about things relating to poltergeist, for example, and when you hear about things relating to the UFO file, when people have these kinds of engagement with this experience that's so outside the norm, and they're dealing with an encounter and lights and all the rest of it, what very often happens is missing time. And other odd things happen too, like mechanical malfunction. And, we also get sort of rings in fields where nothing will grow after these things have been around. This is all part of Apotheum. It's a reality distortion effect where it brings in a secondary physics. And if you go over those stories with a physicist, it's very interesting because they will tell you over and over again where the physics goes upside down. And it's a very interesting comparison. It would make an excellent show in itself. But this much I can say. The day-to-day physics that we come to rely on, the laws of gravity and our basic physical reality, when that's upset, it's anybody's ballgame. Anything can happen. So there is no reality if there's no universal law. So therefore, when people who are in the government encounter people who've had these experiences, or when we talk about crash retrievals and we hear about all these things relating to the UFO file, and we wonder, what is it really? I mean, are they just sitting on all this hidden technology? Why would they classify it, according to physicist Robert Sarbarker, higher than the atomic bomb? It's a good reason, because it upsets, it's not something they've learned to control. It upsets the very nature of reality. So Apotheum, which is Apotheum, is the reason, one, for the mystery school secrecy on one hand, and the X Steganography moving that through the culture for years and years to preserve it. And also, when you get to the UFO file and you see this massive secrecy and paperclip Nazis and X-planes, and we've got the X-35 and the F-35 and the invisible plane technology. It's such incredible secrecy, and you see, like, they will do anything, as we showed in the X Protect show, to guard that secret. So we have to look at things a little bit differently. If we keep that in mind, these older cultures can inform us, I think, better about what it is that they're hiding from. What are they afraid of? So yeah, that's Apotheum.
Shari would like to know, could you describe a little bit more of the head movement in detail? The crashing totem.
I think you've got it there. It is a crashing totem. And if you go and you type Dogon Ritual into YouTube, there's a number of videos. And if you watch the videos, you will see that moment. It always happens. And it's like this, whoa, what is this? One guy really is freaking out. And he moves his head into the dirt with the totem. But he does that enormous head swing. This is a very significant movement. It reminds me very much of the Gurdjieff stop movement, which when you bring in the stop movement, it changes the consciousness of the person. So they would have these instructors in these mystery schools when Gurdjieff was learning these movements, and then he'd hear someone yell stop. So the Stomp Exercise, anyone who's familiar with the Gurdjieff work will understand the Stomp Exercise. This exercise is pretty interesting because it's out of whack with the rest of the dancers and such, that big head twist. And it represents, what we could say is just an incredible disaster brought about, in my opinion, by the Two-Eye Stone that caused a massive pole shift. And this is the shift that happens. It is the Apotheum. It turns everything upside down. But we're going to get deeper and deeper into that. It's nice to have Sherry out there for sure. And Sherry had a birthday recently, so happy birthday,
Happy
Sherry.
birthday.
Another picture of these guys, I don't want us to lose them. This is a very impressive thing they're doing on these stilts. So now we have to wonder why the stilts? Why the stilts? There's always reasons brought forward. They're not satisfactory at all. I can tell you what I've derived from looking at the use of the stilts in combination with who they are engaged with. That is, they're engaged with these beings, these wise beings who create humanity, called the Nomu. And the Nomu are very important. They're very often related to fish, which I find interesting, and we're going to tie in exactly how this tradition moved out and beyond from the Dogon. Let's take a look at them. These are some Nomu, and they're the culture bringers here. They come forward. They're made by this sky goddess Amma, and they are from this Sigi, which is what we know as Sirius. And these creatures are wisdom bringers, and they literally decide to come and improve humanity. And they make a series of twins to do that. But at a certain point, I'll sort of jump ahead in the story and jump back. At a certain point, they make, this is them arriving, actually. Take a look at a ship. I mean, this is their ark, okay? And the ark really looks like a head. It's another mask, which I find very interesting. And also notice these figures, although bald, clearly have breasts. So we're looking at, these are female figures that are arriving. Very, very interesting indeed. And there are some researchers around the Dogon who read that entire early story as just basically a huge mother god story.
I'm going to try to pronounce this. Lohatul Vibite says dog means fish in Hebrew. Did you dig that up in your research?
Oh, isn't that fascinating?
That's great.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, dogs came up over and over again when you research this. And I have a pretty interesting quote, actually, from Homer, from the Iliad. And it's about Sirius, and it says, Sirius rises late in the dark liquid sky, on summer nights, star of stars. Orion's dog, they call it, brightest of all, but an evil portent, bringing heat and fevers to suffering humanity. You ever hear that phrase, the dog days of summer? Apparently, that's from the Greeks. And it relates to these incredibly hot drought days that they would blame on Sirius. Because the name for Sirius in Greek is scorcher. So there's something about, we know very well that Sirius doesn't burn us, and it's not even the sun. So what is it about Sirius that they have in this cosmology about scorching? That's going to give us another clue to what the Dogon are doing, and to the Dogon's origins also. I want to keep looking at the Dogon Ritual for a moment. There's a little show and tell here that's going to pay off big time. By the way, you're watching Dark Journalist, and I want everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and get online with our newsletter, and make sure you get that in your inbox once a week. It's a great pipeline between us, especially with the kind of social media crackdown that we're deep in the middle of. And, things are getting so absurd with the rules and things, and it's so random. They're like, this video doesn't make anyone comfortable, so we're taking it online, offline. And this whole thing about giving themselves the ability to judge these things is absolutely ridiculous. As a little aside, Olivia, the little story we were talking about Netflix, I was on, I had the great pleasure of being on John B. Wells' show, Caravan to Midnight. And I think that shows up now. I just did it a couple of days ago. And we were having a very good time. And I cracked him up because I told him this story that Olivia and I have been kicking around about Netflix. And Netflix has a new policy for their employees, which is you can't look at each other for longer than 5 seconds.
Right. 5 seconds.
Right. So let's break the rule right now, Olivia. Ready?
Okay.
5, 4, 3. Okay, now you can call my boss, I guess. But wait, you'll have to call me, I guess. And I'll have to get rid of me or sanction me. It is pretty interesting,
It's
though.
amazing. What a horrible environment for work culture when you can't actually look at someone and have a conversation and
5
have it-
seconds.
yeah, you can't have any coherence with them whatsoever. No intimacy at all. At
I
work.
guarantee you that that is someone's scientific research study.
Mm.
And, you know, before the show started, we were talking about Rupert Sheldrake, who talks all about these indigenous traditions. And of course, he got banned off TED when he did the talk with Graham Hancock. They both got banned. They're like, hey, don't talk about the real stuff. But one of the things that he's great at talking about are these orthogenetic fields, which we get when we engage with each other, when we look at each other, and all the rest of it. So it is quite interesting because that seems to be just like the smartphone when you see people walking around with that thing in front of their face. And, you know, it's weird. It's really weird that they're moving this. They're trying to move this through the culture and see if anyone notices. Well, we just noticed. But yeah, 5 seconds at Netflix and you're out. Okay. You know, it was something else. But it was good to see John back in action.
He's a good guy.
We've been, you know, John goes back to what you call a good coast, and he's definitely bringing forward the good stuff. Okay, this is more of the comparison in the 1933 ritual with the more modern versions of it, and this gives us more of this idea. But you can see very seriously, them wearing the X masks gives them. What I'm learning about the Dogon tribe is each one of them have their role, but those who wear the X masks are engaging with this group. This other mask over here, they have a different role, and I'm going to get into what that is. More of the Dogon in the X. This is the Siggy ritual, but this is the X aspect. Here are these X masks, and here they are on stilts. Why on stilts? One more, getting ready, getting into position, getting into the mindset, getting into trance, moving into that larger frame of mind to be able to engage. Close up now, going close up on the shots, inside the headdress now, right on the side aspect. Here's that Siggy-esque. X again, that's Sirius X. What are the Dogon trying to tell us about X? Well, it's interesting, you know, if you look at Sirius through the Hubble telescope, this is exactly what you see. That is a picture right from the Hubble telescope. It's a clear X, and it's light reflecting off of the telescope. In their cosmology, as I showed the chart earlier, they have this very unusual X. The entire ceremony, from what I can tell, after watching it and listening to them talk about it, is related directly to this X impact and how they hold the story through the X Steganography. The hold of the story is about the Nomu coming, giving them culture, and then something happened. Now, I'm just going to run through one of the stories. And this relates to the Nomu and setting up this original culture. So they make this set of twins over and over again. And the twins keep coming out. It's kind of like an Adam and Eve story, but elongated. The twins keep coming out female. That is a set of female twins, set of female twins, set of female twins. At a certain point, they get to a single specimen, a single human, and it's a jackal. It's portrayed as a jackal, and it's evil. And so the jackal goes its way and kind of wreaks some mayhem. So they realize that he's kind of a left turn in civilization and development. Now, remember, these are the Dogon elders. These are the Dogon ancestors. The Nomu, the gods, and Amma are bringing them culture. They're bringing them life, very much like Yahweh in the Bible. So when they make these female twins, they get to this male, and then the male is portrayed as this jackal who's basically evil and chaotic, incredibly chaotic. So they decide, you know, we feel bad about this. This is a mix-up. Let's do this. Let's cross one of these twins with that jackal and make it into a full person, so that that whole jackal line is going to be, or what's portrayed as a jackal. I don't think it was an actual jackal. It's a human being. Jackal qualities. So when they do this, they create this being who is kind of chaotic. You know, he's chaos for sure. He's chaotic. And long story short, what he does is he hijacks their ark and he crashes it into the earth, causing a tremendous convulsion and causing a tremendous upheaval. And he basically turns the world upside down. Now, what they do is they retake the ark and they withdraw to the Pleiades, which is interesting because in the Dogon mythology, everything is about Sirius. So this introduction of the Pleiades is quite fascinating. And you can see why when people look at any aspect of this story, there's off-world civilization, ET signatures everywhere. But we're still going to look at it from the point of view of this advanced mystery culture. And then we'll bring in the other aspects. So what happens in the Sigi is that they are drawing these Nomu back. They're bringing them back. Now remember the stilts. Keep the stilts in mind as we come along here. And there's a famous Swiss sculptor and have a very interesting history around this name, I'll tell you. But his name was Alberto Giacometti, and Giacometti was known for his surrealist designs, pretty major in the 20s, 30s, and through the 50s. And now it's just acknowledged as this incredible. Do you have something, Olivia?
No, I want to see the art.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's Giacometti, actually. Quite a remarkable
What a
person.
face.
Yeah. And he did incredible work. He was mostly working out of France, where he had the pleasure of meeting up with Marcel Griot, who was the person who spent all the time with the Dogon and brought us all this information from the blind priest of the Dogon, Aktamali. So these French researchers were there, and they came back and they met Giacometti. And Giacometti became absolutely obsessed with Dogon art. It became the heart of his endeavor, and he brought forward remarkable things. I do think that his incredible history, by the way, the Rockefellers did try to have him do a mural. Anyone who watched our episode on Rockefeller art, I think can really get a lot from this next segment, because what he did is he went forward to work for them, and then he withdrew saying, you know, I could never work for these people and what they wanted him to do.
Didn't he actually do it?
Yes, he made the original mural. And it's an interesting thing because I'm still trying to find out if we can get a look at that mural, because it's not in any of his listed works, and it's not at the Guggenheim where most of his stuff is. But I would be curious if anyone has his work for his mural for the Rockefellers.
Do you know what prompted him to withdraw his art?
No, this is the thing. He felt that they were basically reprehensible.
And we don't know why.
No, but it's very interesting because, of course, as we brought forward in the Rockefeller episode, they had the same problem with Riviera. So, But anyway, Giacometti is fascinating, and we are going to get into him more as we go along here. Now, remember the stilts? Remember the stilts. This is Giacometti's knockoff on the Dogon art, and considering the Nomu. Let's look at Giacometti more of the impressions. Look at the size of these beings. They're absolutely gigantic. In one of the events of the Nomu engaging the populace, they're coming to bring great things, but what happens is they have someone set up among the Dogon, who is the master of speech, and she goes out to meet the Nomu, and she gets like a lightning bolt in her third eye and is killed by it. So over and over again, we see this kind of motif among Dogon art, which is the covering of the face when you're dealing with these higher realities. Something very, very deep going on with this. But let's look at Giacometti a little bit more. Again, think of the size. The size. Look at these beings. They're incredibly tall and incredibly thin.
Somebody in the chat mentioned they look like shadows.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah,
yeah,
I love that.
Absolutely. Well, that gives you a real idea there, because we can figure that she's about 5'3". That middle being that's probably a 10 to 12 foot tall sculpture, I would reckon. Just incredible, absolutely incredible. This is Giacometti, who really spent the majority of his later career working solely on Dogon-inspired art. And you can find a lot of that art over here at Harvard. You can find a great majority at the Guggenheim. And it's a great, great art search. But let's think about our friends for a minute here. What's going on here, if we're comparing the two, is we're getting an idea. Two things are going on. Let's take it literal for a moment. In order to engage the beings that came here, they have to stand on these 10-foot poles. That's the first kind of anthropological answer you could give for something like this, before we pull in more mythical connotations. Whatever they're engaging is so much bigger that in order to want to engage them again, they are imitating them. We've seen this over and over again with native cultures and traditions. They try to imitate the gods to have them return. Now, I do think that when we're looking at the Dogon and we're looking at their creation story, and when we're looking at their astronomical knowledge, which is scientifically based, it's a fact that they knew about Sirius B and Sirius C before modern astronomy did. So the question comes back, how did they know? Obviously, they got the astronomical knowledge from somewhere. And that's where the story takes a pretty wild turn. I'm going to show some earlier versions of this. And I'm going to show you these embedded X's in the ritual, because they're not, like, we see the really obvious ones, like the masks and all the rest of it. But that X Sirius signature is throughout the Dogon rituals. And they would tell you it represents the Siggi. And the Siggi are these beings from Sirius. Okay. Here's an early version of one of those, and he's been doing that for a while. He's called, this is a 1933 picture. He's called the Hogan, which is the high priest of the Dogon. And he's the one who gives out this great knowledge. Now, it's an interesting thing about the Hogan in the Dogon tribe. They are heaped with praise. They are set up as kind of the pinnacle of the whole society. They're basically the president and the high priest, but they can't be touched. You cannot soil them with a touch. And basically it lowers their vibration. I think what's worthwhile in considering that is whatever level that priest has to be on to stay on it, they had to have him totally be in a particular frequency in order to engage with the Nomu. And any human, regular person who wasn't in this highly meditative state would just throw it off. So it's kind of an interesting, I would say, descendant of this background that they have that high priest now, and still now to this day, you cannot touch the high priest. And he can't touch anybody. Very, very fascinating. Okay, so I think we've covered Giacometti, and we need to kind of get a view as to what and why the Dogon are there, and what and why they're protecting. What is it that they're basically keeping up tradition of? What is the tradition that they're moving forward with? While we move into the next segment, Miss Olivia, if you want to hit me with what you've got so far.
Let's see. Well, Griffin Eagle 7 wanted to know if Steiner ever visited West Africa and the Dogon specifically.
No, I think that the Dogon were highly inaccessible. That's how they survived all these years, because there were Muslim groups that chased them out of wherever they were, who wanted to convert them to the Muslim thing. And I'll tell you what's interesting. When I looked at two traditions that the Muslims were particularly animated about, one of them was the Yezidi, and the other one was the Dogon. And the reason was the Muslims, basically with Jews and Christians, said, well, they're followers of a book, so they're kind of like us. But if they knew a group that had a tradition that they couldn't control, in a sense, and they couldn't say our book is better than your book, if it was an oral tradition, then they made extra efforts to convert that group to their Muslim religion. And, you know, there were persecutions, and the Dogon have been drifting for a long time. Now, I'm going to suggest something here which is not in any of these books, and it's my own personal conclusion, but I do feel that it is exactly right, and I think that we can prove it. There's the entire background of Giza, Egypt, has always been in doubt because of the dating, the 2500 BC dating. As I've said when we started the show, Graham Hancock and others, and Robert Schoch, proved there was weather watering on the Sphinx that came from rains. And that told us that those types of rains now didn't fall in Egypt till 10,000 BC. So therefore, we know that culture was older who set up the Sphinx. Now, Graham went on record in my interview, and Graham is one of the most noted. Actually, his new book is here, his latest book, Magicians of the Gods, which I highly recommend. And it's one of those books I go back to over and over again about these traditions. But Graham basically said that, you know, when you're looking at this end of the spectrum, you have to kind of rely on something far beyond what Egyptology accepts, because they throw things out. Now, there's something called the inventory stela of the pyramid, which, you know, lists a different dating system for Egypt completely. And what it does also is it says, you know, at the time, this whole thing about Khufu and building the pyramid and all that, it's basically talking about how they can redevelop the pyramid because it's such an ancient, and how they have to really consult these old records in order to reconstitute and put the pyramid, you know, kind of basically redevelop it as, you know, you'd redevelop a house or something that was falling apart. So that's what they did in 2500 BC. That's where that whole dating thing comes from. And it's weird to suggest, but this whole story is quite twisted, and I'm going to lay it out this way. The people who are the staunchest believers and were the staunchest blocks against this new dating of 10,000 BC for the pyramids, which makes much more sense, were Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner. Both Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner received money and support, and one of them was sent through college by the Edgar Cayce Foundation. So they know all about the traditions and the secrecy around Egypt and Atlantis. So for them to play dumb and to stick to the timing, you know, raises a few eyebrows, to say the least.
He was a barefoot hippie, right?
That's true. Mark Lehner is pretty interesting, because I have a book of his called The Egyptian Heritage, which shows his incredible knowledge of the Cayce readings. But the problem is, it's from 1974, and he was basically in his 20s when he wrote it. He was dating Hewlin Cayce's daughter, and he was a high school dropout who was working, you know, doing kind of like a farm stand thing and like surfing on couches and stuff. And Hewlin Casey said, if I basically invest in you and bring you forward as our Egyptologist, will you go over there and find the Hall of Records and prove my father's readings right? So that's Mark Lehner, who you see on these programs sitting around talking about, well, the pyramids and, the Egyptians had pot shards and let's look at their pottery. And, I mean, come on, I think we're past that stage. But keep in mind, these are Edgar Casey associated people. They know the readings. They're on our wavelength with Atlantis. They know about the Hall of Records. And when I talked to Graham, he told me unquestionably the biggest blocks were those two. So other people, even the most staunch academics, they were a lot more on board with, hey, let's try to look at changing the data, whatever. The toughest critics were the Casey people. How does that make any sense? So what they had done basically is they were taking the money and the information from the Casey people, but they were kissing up to the Egyptian government and the archaeological and Egyptological establishment. So they were hiding the truth. That's a very simple way to look at it. And they would not rock the boat with the discoveries. Let's keep that in mind because the Dogon story goes right into Casey, and I'm going to show you where this hits. In the Casey readings, he talks about the fleeing Atlanteans fleeing this Apotheum destruction. Now, they go into Egypt and they place into Egypt this Hall of Records, and they use the Sphinx as the kind of the sentinel or guard of the whole thing. And it's kind of a magical ceremony. They set up the pyramids and all the rest. There's a weirder piece of this too, which is that they did a lot of archaeology. So they were doing archaeology on the site. So that's how old the site is. If they're doing this in 10,000 BC and it's already archaeology on it as a sacred site, that's even a bigger question. Why is it a sacred site already in 10,000 BC? Well, let's stick with this story. Casey moves his own history, and he talks about this priest Rata. Rata is the priest who comes into Egypt and works with the Atlanteans to do this Hall of Records ceremony. Rata becomes a leading figure in the new Egypt. It's a couple of cultures and the Atlanteans crammed together, and the Atlanteans try to take power and all the rest of it. What they end up doing is setting up a political trick, basically, and throwing Rata out. Rata leaves with a number of followers. Rata has advanced information from Atlantis. Rata goes to, according to the Casey readings, Libya. He stays there for 40 years. Doing what? Astronomical observations, setting up observatories with the advanced Atlantean technology, watching the stars, basically creating the predictions, creating the entire scenario for building the Great Pyramid. So when he gets called back, because there's a civil war in Egypt, and this is again more of the Casey dialogue, there's a civil war in Egypt and they call back Rata, and he takes with him a number of people that he left with. But a lot of the people that he left with are already there. They've intermarried with the natives and all the rest of it. What happens is he leaves, and the people he leaves behind will be incredibly astronomically trained. They will have access to Rata's Mystery School Atlantean knowledge, and they will have the benefit of having been taught by Rata for 40 years. And part of them, remember, are the crew that got banished from Egypt. I hope that story is pretty clear. If it's not, the Edgar Casey on Atlantis book is a very good start for figuring out that story. But in essence, it's this. Rata the priest, who was intersecting with the Atlanteans, intersecting with these other cultures while Atlantis was going down to save their high technology, to save their information in Egypt, becomes a big wheel, a big shot in Egypt as a high priest. And then the Atlanteans who have migrated into Egypt, who don't want to be subject to the Egyptians that are there, try to take over, and they figure the main obstacle is Rata. They boot him and banish him with a number of his followers to Libya, and there he is for 40 years working with the tribes in Libya. So we have a tribe now that Rata has left behind in Libya, who have incredible astronomical information, who have access to the Atlantean mysteries and the knowledge of the X Apotheum. Where do they go? Well, the Dogon's own story is they wandered. They wandered for thousands of years. And they escaped persecution by different tribes and finally found this spot in Mali that is surrounded by hills that no one can get at them. That's how they got there. There's no question for me that the tribe that wandered from Libya with Rata's advanced astronomical Atlantean knowledge is the same tribe that showed up later as the Dogon in Mali. When you put those two together, then their incredible advanced knowledge and their incredible understanding of even off-world civilizations, and the fact that they had astronomical knowledge way before Western astronomy knew about Sirius B or C, which we've only, it's pretty recent development. So it's clear Rata's tribe is the Dogon. They moved across from Rata's point. Their whole setup story, if you read it, about these twins and about this jackal who becomes the kind of epitome of evil on Earth, and the fact that when they try to crossbreed across the DNA between this kind of evil jackal breed and the twins, they get this out of control, chaotic individual that hijacks their ark and crashes it into the Earth and causes a pole shift. Well, this is a fantastic telling of the Belial group that we've done in these stories before and how they hijacked that advanced Atlantean technology, and the Emilius group tried to stop them. And the Emilius group, which Rata is part of, they're the ones who hide the records of Atlantis and Egypt, while Belial basically blows everything up. That, if you get that snapshot, then we're getting into some deep territory. Now, go back to the Dogon story real briefly. The Nomo retake the Ark and they evacuate to the Pleiades. And so these Sigi festivals are to call them back. Now, there's a really interesting note I made to myself about mistletoe, but I think I'll save that for later. So now, there's a group here relating to all this, and they're called the Seven Sages. But the interesting thing is they don't just show up in these stories. They show up in Egypt, in Sumeria, India, Mexico. And we're going to see now how they relate. And this is something in my conversation with Graham Hancock, and you will find some of this in his book, Magicians of the Gods, that they are the bearers of a massive fish imagery of an advanced culture giving knowledge to these individual tribes to help them grow. Again, remember the Nomu, as I showed, have all that fish imagery. I mean, yes, we saw the great big tall ones, but when you saw up close, they had that fish covering. Let's take a look now at who, let's call these the Oannes group, which is the name of it. Again, you're watching darkjournalist.com, and I want you to go there to darkjournalist.com. Mm-hmm. Make sure that you sign up for the newsletter. How you doing over there, Miss Olivia?
Doing fantastic.
How are the people burning it up? It's a huge crowd tonight.
Yes, really big crowd.
Fantastic. I love it. Everyone, it's so ridiculous to even call it the chat. I want to really change the name of that. It's really the ideas room, isn't it? That's really where we are. It's funny. A great thing about this work that we're doing is when you're working on something and something happens right in the middle of what you're working on relates directly to it and is a breakthrough. That's the wonderful thing about dark journalism in general. But let's take a look at these cultures relating to this fish imagery. That'll take us to the Nomu from the Dogon story. Let's go now to the Sumerian story of Oannes. Let's see if we can get a handle on this fish aspect and relate it to Atlantis and maybe an off-world culture. Okay. These figures they have two identifiable aspects to them. They have this fish, And you can see at the top of the head is a fish. It's a fish outfit, basically. It's like, what are you going to do for Halloween? You're wearing the fish. Here, they have this very unusual handbag. And it's known as, the magic bag. The way that the quick reference to it now, the kind of colloquial terms that we use. And there's this wristband often with the sunburst on it. So a fish covering and the Oannes bag, this kind of magic bag. Let's see if we can follow steganography on this one. Closer and closer still. Sumerian, carrying the bag here. What's in the bag? We're going to get to what's in the bag. Here's some of the major, they call them Apkala, the wise sages, and early culture, Sumeria, Mesopotamia. I don't know if you can see these as well. The bag, again, they're carrying the bag. Oh, here's a really, so I'm going to point that one out closely here. That's the bag. Okay, the bag becomes a signifier that they're bringing in this cultural, this higher cultural impulse. But there's more. Now, I could sit here all night and show you pictures from India, from China, from Iran, just like the rabbits, just like the three-hair symbol that is impossible to interpret now. But instead, let's float between the Middle East and Mexico and the Mayan Olmec civilizations. Here's Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, as they say, holding the bag in Mexico. Here. He's got the bag, and he's on the other coast, and he's bringing, again, from this cultural devastation, this information. But his steganography is the bag. So we're left with an image now that says, there's a whole story about Oannes, and if you want to look up this Babylonian historian named Berosus, he'll give you the story of how these people came out and they had these fish costumes on, basically. He said, well, they look like men, basically, but they had a fish, so I guess they're man-fish. Very interesting imagery considering the devastation that had just taken place. Obviously, they're coming out of the sea, but they're actually wearing something relating to a fish. No question about it, to such confusion. Now, Göbekli Tepe is a site in Turkey, and it's only just been discovered. Originally it was uncovered in the 1990s, but nobody did any professional digging on it and all the rest of it. But there was a huge breakthrough, as we know, about 5 years ago, and now it is the oldest developed site. It's far older than the term they give for Egypt. It's 12,000 years old. So how do you explain this? I mean, this gives us much more of a tight timeline with the Graham Hancock style, 10,000. And remember, 10,500 BC is the date that Casey gives for the Atlantean arrival in Egypt and setting up the pyramids and Sphinx. You go into anthroposophy or theosophy, you're going to find those older dates, no question about it. So this now, 12,000 years ago, Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, on the building, straight up, the handbag again. Here we are, Olivia. How's that for a handbag? Mm-hmm. Pretty fashionable.
Yeah.
And I like, there's this kind of laid back duck image here, and he's holding this Apotheum ball there. But this is quite a motif.
That, are you talking about this one over here with the weird beak?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
That's not a duck.
This here, what would you call it? It's some kind of.
That's more like almost like a vulture or something.
Yes,
like that.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Everything. Well, there's interesting frogs jumping out of the bags too. So there's a few.
These
things.
are shamanic images.
Absolutely, no question about it. We're right back where we started with the original shamanic versions. So I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalist, and I want to make sure everyone goes to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, and get on board with the work that we're doing. You know, when you get behind work like this, it makes a difference. Like something shifts, things change, and we have to kind of remember to make that effort. But most importantly, make sure that you're signed up so that we stay in touch, because the nature of the kind of social media crunch crackdown, it's going to be absolutely crucial. And we had that kind of wild thing happen with Twitter this week. And so you really want to make sure you're on there. Also, you know, in social media, it's twitter.com/darkjournalist, facebook.com/darkjournalist. And all that's at darkjournalist.com. So it is crucial, you know, kind of get invested, get behind the story, and make sure you subscribe to Dark Journalist. It's a much better way to kind of engage. You know, people often ask me about different ways to help the show. Really, basically just subscribe to the show, because that helps the research and it helps us to move the ball downfield. And, you know, I always say this is a really pivotal point. And you can tell with the social media crackdown, what you want to do is get behind the truth tellers out there. And if you find the information valuable, you know, get behind it. It's like the work that we do. We support so many people in what we do. And, you know, the work of WikiLeaks, we support the work of WikiLeaks. And I always say get behind people like Forbidden Knowledge TV or Alexandra Bruce and Solari.com with Catherine Austin Fitt's work. You know, there's so many good things out there that we need to move forward to get this answer out there. So with that, now I am going to go a little bit deeper into this handbag motif. Now, what did we really take on? That we have this motif that shows up over and over again on both sides. Now we're finding it in 12,000-year-old monuments. What does it mean? How does it relate to what we've been looking at with the steganography of these mystery schools moving things forward since the time of Atlantis and Egypt and the Book of the Dead? Well, oddly enough, the answer to that might be found in a little strange story, a little interesting group called the Yezidis. And the Yezidis are really quite remarkable because they show up and they come kind of on the radar when they're brought up by Gurdjieff discussing the mystery schools and how his own curiosity was developed when he was growing up in Greek Armenia. The Yezidis are predominantly located in Iran and Iraq, I'm sorry, northern Iraq. And what happens very often with the Yezidis is they've been known in a very superstitious way as a magic group, or, you know, they have that kind of almost or that reputation of people don't quite know what to make of them, and there's all these stories about them. But in essence, they come out of a kind of Zoroastrian tradition, and there's something very, very unusual, including this worship of a cosmological peacock. So it's like E.T. Peacock, as I pointed out, Olivia. That has to be you've seen that.
Yes,
yeah,
they're
remarkable.
Beautiful images. But
Well,
it's the only tradition that holds the peacock as their icon, right?
Right. We don't find that anywhere else. So it begs the question immediately, what's going on with this incredible Yezidi group? The Yezidis are, the way that Gurdjieff described them is that when he was a boy growing up, one of the great incidents that made him curious about mysticism was that he saw a Yezidi in a circle. And these other boys were torturing the boy in the circle because he couldn't get out. And so he was trying to get away from the boys, but because they'd drawn the circle around him, he couldn't move. So the Yezidis had this theme of a magic circle. Later, Gurdjieff would try to follow up on this with one of these Yezidi priestess girls. And he said to her, you know, I want to learn the secret of what's going on here. And she said, if you can draw a circle around me and you cannot pull me out of the circle. So they drew the circle around her, and sure enough, these boys could not pull this priest girl. I mean, they were teenagers by then, but they couldn't pull her out. So what happened eventually is they got a group of them together, and they tried to pull her out of the circle, and they succeeded. And she went into like kind of a cataleptic trance. And Gurdjieff was freaked out because he was just trying to discover what the magic of the Yezidis was. And now he's like, oh my God, I'm in trouble. So he instinctively drags her back into the circle where she's fine. And she rubs out the circle and takes off. Now, that story kind of, it made us understand just in a regular way how the magic of the Yezidis is part of the culture of what they have going on. But they definitely inherited this incredible esoteric ability, which, all these groups would accuse them of witchcraft and, bad omens and all this kind of stuff. But what they were doing literally was working as a magical culture. Very unusual, right in the middle of the Middle East. And again, the Muslims targeted them heavily because they did not have a book tradition. They had an oral tradition. And for these people who are trying to control the story, as we find in the major religions, they didn't want anything jumping out of their story. They don't like it when people don't have a book, because then you can't alter the book. You can't sort of, they're not on the same page. You need to convert them or worse, as we've found in all these religious persecutions. Often the mystery schools are persecuted, but what we're looking at here are these kind of public tribes who hold the mystery truths, like the Dogon. And very much like the Laplanders, who we covered in last week's show. We could have done an entire segment in this show relating the same way to the Laplander culture, which is known for their incredible prescient powers that go into healing, that go into psychic discovery. And we find out that other cultures were actually afraid of them. It's funny because the modern face of the Laplanders are the Sami people, and they still integrate some of this, but there's that echo of these older Laplanders and that really primeval magic that they had. But they're an incredible culture, a beautiful culture. Actually, Renee Zellweger is she's a fantastic actress. She's a Sami Laplander, and it's quite remarkable because this incredible background, I think, that's going to be studied and understood about that culture by having someone as a sort of celebrity representative of the entire culture. Now we're going to get a much better picture of who they are. But it is interesting when we look at this, because we have to start to wonder, why now do we have, with the Yezidis, the incredible persecution that happens to them now? And this is what I want to get into, because it's a modern crisis at the UN, which is how to prevent the Yezidis from getting, exterminated, because ISIS targeted them over everyone else. Isn't that interesting? And ISIS, of course, is this phantom group in the Middle East that sprung up, and supposedly, we've got all these satellites and everything, and we have all this way of tracking SWIFT money and all the rest of it, but these guys could run around and do whatever they want, usually with great tanks and machine guns, and just take over villages. I mean, we knew who they were. Why we didn't stop them, I have no idea, but I can tell you that whoever they're working for, they were targeting these groups, and they were targeting the steganography of the bag, and I'm going to show you how that works. See, one of the things that I pointed out is that the Golden Dawn tried to imitate a lot of the magic rituals that the Yezidi tribes would do, and the Yezidis kind of live in the mythology. This is a picture of a modern Yezidi priestess girl. She's really that, they're kind of grooming her to take over that role, the sacred role in the culture. So I do have a picture. There's so many pictures of that peacock. I did go for a more casual version of it instead of the disco hardcore peacock. This is this cosmic peacock, the blue peacock that they worship.
God, is that gorgeous?
Unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
And their story of the peacock, I think, hides something quite remarkable because, again, that, like the Dogon, that peacock has extraterrestrial origin in the story. And there, of course, is the picture from Meetings with Remarkable Men, which is a depiction of Gurdjieff seeing the Yezidi boy in the circle, not being able to get out. This is a very important kind of crucial moment that takes place there, and Gurdjieff witnesses this because he realizes, oh, there's a kind of magic that has a physical control over people. That's a big breakthrough. This is the headlines that we've been seeing. The Yazidis are in danger of extinction. And you see this in that's a Canadian newspaper, but you see in the UK, and even the New York Times did a big thing on it. So the ISIS group, very interestingly, there's some, I'm getting some good focus there. There we go. The ISIS group targeted them, and they took, now these are very low numbers. Actually, I think we might want to triple the actual number, but they took 3,000 of them as sex slaves. And they created mass graves and like machine gun the men and all this stuff. So now there were a lot of groups that they went after, but they had a particular passion and a particular edge in destroying the Yazidis. The Yazidis are still there, of course, and they fought back to some degree this incredible onslaught from ISIS. But why? And they destroyed a number of their religious centers and their worship centers, very crucial. But I want to show you something very interesting that the ISIS group promoted themselves in showing them destroying some of this work in Iraq. Ready? That is a member of ISIS destroying what? Take a good look. That's the handbag. Where's the hammer headed? For the handbag. And what he does is he destroys the whole statue. So who was hiring ISIS to destroy the handbag and basically post it as a selfie? And why is ISIS after the Yazidis? Why are they hell-bent on destroying them in the Middle East? Why are the Dogon being intimidated by Muslim groups now that everyone knows where they are? Something heavy is afoot there, where it's an attempt to silence those groups or to extract from something from them. And the charade on top, which is brutal and absolutely horrible, is this, this marauding group. But which priests are they grabbing and interrogating to understand their traditions, to get into the magic that they are putting forward? See, we have to understand these things from a perspective not just anthropological or archaeological. I did a show a number of years ago with Joseph Farrell on archaeological wars. And we have to look at it that way. In a number of ways, the 2003 Iraq War was an archaeological war looking for something. Here we have, again, these Yazidis holding this mystical magic, and we have ISIS going after them. But then ISIS pulling a selfie, destroying the very God bag that we're talking about. We have to think to ourselves, who's hiring them to do it? And why haven't they been gotten rid of? And we hear less about them now. So yeah, they've been driven out of certain towns, but they were given free range for what, 5 years? Under the Obama administration. So that intersection of the ancient mysteries, the Dogon story, the higher realities that it represents with the modern political reality, we come face to face with the fact that when we're looking at X Steganography, we're talking about the things that are going on in our world now and that have gone on for centuries and that are part of an X Steganography tradition handed down over many centuries from many mystery schools. And with that, I am going to turn everything over to Miss Olivia.
Okay.
Thank you for being so patient.
All right. There's so many different topics to follow up on. Okay. The first thing is everyone's making mention that the Pope's hat is, it's a fish. And so.
Oh, true. I did. There's actually a lame picture with the Pope that I decided not to use, but now you made me do it.
Okay.
Here it is. It's this. Okay. We've got. There's a fish here. There's Awanas, and that is the Pope with the fish hat. But my problem was this picture of the Pope was kind of like, hey, I'm the Pope. I'm up to evil. Olivia, check it out. This is yours. There it is.
Yeah.
He's so
Mm-hmm.
lackadaisical Pope.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so thanks. It's an excellent point. The Pope's hat is also very unusual, and you have to look up the story of Lucifer's crown when you really want to compare those two, because there's something definitely unusual going on. Okay, I'm ready
so
for you.
JJK wants to know, what does the X mean to the Dogon? And David Tormina is asking, DJ, are you saying the Dogon are the origin of the X Steganography?
Well, whoever gave the X to the Dogon is part of the origin of it. I'm sure they went to a number of groups to preserve it over the world. But what's great about the Dogon is they kind of weren't contaminated by culture. So they kept the tradition as it was for centuries. That's important because very often you find these cultures trying to rediscover themselves. These guys had it, and they hadn't been kind of driven underground. They'd been driven across Africa, but they found a place basically that was defensible. And at a certain point, people were like, it's the equivalent of going to the Himalayas. Like, we're not going to go up there to go after them. Forget it. But it is interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry. What was the other part of that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I deleted already.
No. I think the thrust of it was, are they the origin of the X? And I would say that they are part of a diffusion. And that the diffusion, I think we get a much better handle on it when we start to think about how that handbag shows up in Mexico. Because the handbag motif, like the X, like the three hairs imagery, it's a symbol that moves through the cultures. It's a sign for those who understand it. That's the whole point of the X steganography, is just like that. It is a text within a text. And so if I know it, different than cryptography, different than a puzzle, it is something which we deal with in everyday life, but it means something different to someone who knows. So that's what steganography is. And the X steganography is so incredible that it sweeps through thousands of years of our history with not getting questioned, really, until we started doing the series. Actually, some people have pointed out over the years, but nobody has realized that the X steganography runs through all these different things. This is where we are. And I think that's really the edge of why we're breaking into something new, because the X is a key, as I started off the program, just like the Rosetta Stone. Okay.
Face Templar says, what does the Dogon X mean was the question. Sirius is the answer.
Yes, exactly. That's how we started the program, which is their definition of the Siggy is the X. And that's why you see it in the masks. You'll see it in their sheds when they keep the wheat. The X is throughout it, but it's particularly in the rituals because that's who they're trying to draw back. For them, that X ritual relates directly to their progenitors. And what is fascinating about them is it's an amazing culture, incredibly low crime, practically no crime. And there was something interesting about the Yezidis that made me curious. Oh, yes. Actually, I wanted to go back to this real quickly. The Yezidis have a very unusual food restriction, which I found fascinating. First of all, they believe in reincarnation, one, which is pretty remarkable considering where they are, surrounded by Christians, Jews, and Muslims, none of which believe in reincarnation. Melek Taus is the name of the celestial peacock there. No pork, no alcohol, and are you ready? The worst of all, the most addictive, no lettuce. That's really interesting.
Wow.
Quite interesting. I didn't know what to make of that. But in any case, I think that we do kind of jump backwards and forwards. When you're looking at the Yezidi, you're looking at another aspect, like the Dogon, that have preserved the tradition. That's so important. That's so crucial. And that's the real hardcore shamanistic tradition from where they are, that they're maintaining this indigenous understanding. They're preserving it because we've lost so much in the Western culture. As much as we've advanced, we've lost all of that knowledge. We need these cultures to show us the way back.
Okay, so Similar Minds says, okay, that is not a bag, that is an ark. He brings the ark.
Yeah, it's true. Well, it is known as the bag, and obviously it's, let's face it, on the surface, looking at it, it's a bag. They're carrying a bag. Now, you're right, actually, because there is a very interesting handle on it. And I agree with you that there's a number of there's a lot of symbolism I think you can read into it. And at the British Museum, they have a number of these on their own. Now, Olivia, as you know, in shamanic traditions,
Yes.
there's something called the medicine pouch.
Yes.
And that is it's the similar, you see that we're getting the same kind of motif, pretty much.
That's what I think.
Absolutely.
So Niall Parkinson says the handbag represents altered states of consciousness. And David Tormina says, how does the handbag relate to Joseph Farrell's idea of hidden ancient weaponry?
Well, it's interesting. You're going to get an answer for that question when I have Gigi Young on the show next Friday, because that's exactly the issue that we discussed this afternoon, oddly enough.
So let me ask you this. The sculptures, the reliefs with the handbags, are those of initiates or are they of the gods?
They're wisdom bringers.
Okay.
So they're remembered as gods, but it's this group of 7 sages. So sages, God, they're wise men. Like when Quetzalcoatl comes across with a beard, to Mexico, he is revered as a god, but was he just a highly advanced Atlantean spreading this information to natives? Quite possibly. And I think this is interesting because we have advanced initiate, god, and alien, right? And we're always trying to figure out what's going on here. I would say most of the time you're dealing with advanced initiate. Very rarely god and very rarely alien.
Okay.
I mean, the initiate has the knowledge of God, you'll say, but actually dealing directly with a being that is a god, those 3 levels, I would say it's rare, right? The god part is rare, the alien part is rare, and the initiate is also rare, but more common in these situations. Okay, so Scruples 4444 says, please ask DJ's take on a possible connection between ley lines and the position of stargates and them being the potential power source for the gates. Do you think it is a coincidence that a ley line focus point is in Mali? Oh, fantastic. Well, bringing the ley lines is absolutely important, especially if you want to understand sacred archaeology and geomancy, because when we look at it, they understood the magnetic currents throughout the earth and the crisscrossing of those currents, and they built those monuments, those ancient cultures, on those ley lines. I'd have to say that when you look at the idea of stargates, which are so rich and I think are kind of abused in the New Age, I think there's a rich tradition of understanding what that is. And what it is basically is that at a certain point, we reach a certain thinning of the veils that happens between this world and that world, and they can kind of overlap and interchange, basically. But it's an astrological alignment that sets up the scenario. So what we're looking at is, in astrology, you can find over the years these incredible, like Pythagoras, looking for certain astrological setups coming in the future in order to see basically when these stargates were going to show up. These cultures study it to understand when there's that opening. What is a stargate in essence? It's communication between one realm and another. Now, some people would say, oh, well, a stargate opens and aliens come down and, you go to an alien world and that's it, right? You're just thinking alien straight up. You have to go deeper, I think, when thinking about off-world civilizations, because if you look at the mystery schools and how they portray beings that belong to other realities. For example, Casey talked very much about a Venus body. And a Venus body is something that exists on an ethereal plane, and that when human beings move into this reincarnation cycle, they will, in between lives, go off and become part of this Venus cycle. And they'll have experiences in that reality. And he said it's the closest to the physical reality that we have here, but it's totally different. So for us just to picture a regular alien, coming through that Stargate and showing up and being fully physical is a stretch. That, by the way, there's a rich history, as we've seen through the UFO file, of off-world visitors. And, obviously the alien aspect of that is pretty clear. I'm just saying when we use that to rub out all these other interchanges that take place between astral beings and beings in etheric realms and planetary realms as part of the reincarnation cycle. For example, Ahriman, as Steiner describes him, as a force, right? He's a dark astral force, but at a certain point he has a physical incarnation. But the rest of the time, you're not going to see him moving around in a spaceship. It's a force, it's an astral force. So we need to awaken, I think, to that whole side of things instead of just looking for a kind of hot rod UFO with advanced gods in it. I think it's really good if we look at the alien aspect as, I use the word peer. They're peers. They can add things to civilization. It can be a situation where they're coming to us the same way we would come to natives in New Guinea, and we would seem quite amazing to them. But when you get right down to it, that's more of a peer situation. However, there are higher beings who literally are involved in our evolutionary change, and to us, they are, they have that higher role. You call them angels, you call them gods. That's a different kind of hierarchy in a sense. And so I don't put the alien reality into that hierarchy.
Okay, Mayan Taurus, do the Dogon talk about the return of their gods?
Yes, and that's what the Siggy's all about. And, from what I can get on it, is that they are absolutely dedicated to this idea of their ancestor, gods coming back to save them and to create the new world with them. And the Siggy ritual is intense. And if you think about what Casey and Gurdjieff were saying about these movements in the dances being books, you think about that book at the point where the Dogon headdress goes into the dirt and shows us that Apotheum. That's the change. That is when something changed. And it relates to the misuse of this 2i crystal, which basically short-circuited everything. That's what those mystery school traditions are telling us. That's why the X is invented. But I think we do need to get a bigger picture of that. I think if we had the emphasis on the Atlantean culture and its impact on us and understanding how the mystery schools moved that, then we're dealing with it's a whole different scenario. We're in a much better place to understand things that are going on, as opposed to just running after the Anunnaki, for example, which, by the way, Anunnaki is like saying engineer, so it doesn't really tell us much, it's a title. So we need to go a lot deeper.
Kontiki Man wants to know,
yes,
do the Dogon
Kontiki
have an
Man.
explanation for why they left in the first place? Now, you covered this, but you covered it really quickly.
Well,
with that mythology.
It is. I mean, you can look at the story and read it a few different ways, okay? Because people have come away with it differently. And I think, Temple's book is a good foundation. You could start there. There are other authors who bring in the ET aspect in a heavier way. And then you could start with the original book by that Occhianelli gave to Marcel Griot. And that original book, of working with the Dogon, is fascinating. I mean, it's his account. There are some people who have gone and stayed among the Dogon in recent times, and we get a hint that they're a little more under pressure nowadays. But it does feel like their tradition and what they're doing is so important that they've been targeted, just like the Yezidis have been targeted, and the ancient artwork maintaining the handbag imagery has been targeted by really weird groups like ISIS, which go in and commit genocide and do all this beheading and all this stuff. So that's what people are going to hear about. But interestingly enough, them pumping the secrets out of these tribes for what they know about relating to the kind of steganography and the magic of those tribes, that's really what they're after, in my opinion. Because otherwise, I don't think they'd take selfies of it and show it.
Aussie Cell, do we know why the Dogon ceremonies occur at 60-year intervals?
That has something to do with the astronomical setup. And they're right, again, which is that we get into alignment with Sirius over these 60-year periods. And that's actually how we learned to figure out to be able to see, because we didn't take a picture of Sirius B until 1970, even though we discovered it earlier. But the Dogons had it way before we did. So there's a huge discrepancy there. I take it back to Casey's Rata story, because that's the only thing for me that makes sense about their advanced astronomy, unless you literally want to go to the idea that their Syrian ancestors came here from Sirius physically as beings and gave them astronomical information. There's no question that, there's this group, the Seven Sages, that we've seen show up in these traditions over and over again to help move humanity forward after these great disasters. I basically think of them as mystery school operators. They're initiates of that period, giving out the secret knowledge, as opposed to aliens bringing it down. I think of aliens a little bit differently. I think of them as interacting. I don't see them as bringing culture.
A cult fan wants to know if the Dogon speak of dimensions rather than planets.
Well, what's fascinating, I'm glad you asked that, actually, because the Dogon showed also the 4 moons of Jupiter in their artwork that dated back for hundreds of years before we had discovered it. As a matter of fact, they discovered circulation before our medical people understood what circulation was. So, they had advanced knowledge, and where they got it from, if you look directly into their story, has to do with these Nomu. And the Nomu gave them that information, and that's where all these things about the stilts and all this incredible imagery comes from. It is quite fascinating. However, the Nomu have the fish, they're described as dragging a gill, as a fishtail. They're dragging a fishtail and they have gills. So they're fish, just like the Oannes handbag people are fish. So what is that fish motif? Remember, they identified the early Christians, Christ as a fish, because he was related to the Piscean age. So we've got that fish overlap. And how many images did I show tonight where the guy's just he's wearing a huge fish? I mean, that's a code to be cracked. We got to do it. And, I had a deep conversation with Graham Hancock about it. He's the person who's done the most to crack it in his works in Magicians of the Gods.
Phase Templar says 60 years has to do with the elliptical orbits of Sirius.
Yes.
And Summerled said 59 would be 2 revolutions of Saturn.
Nice. Well, yeah. The first one is the official explanation, the actual orbit, and then the other one is interesting about Saturn. Okay.
Okay, so Titan Blood wants to know, are the Dogon a tribe or more of a priesthood or mystery school?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you get civilizations that have mystery schools, and then you get tribes that hold mystery school truths, it's kind of like macrocosm, microcosm. So they're a small snapshot of a group that's led by a mystery school, whereas the mystery schools have to operate in secret in regular public society. So in America, the mystery schools had a great influence in the revolution, in setting it up, in the cultural movements, in a number of things, in a number of ways. But they're not known by the general culture. In these cultures, they worship the idea that these wise men can lead the culture. They need it. So in a way, they're kind of public mystery schools because they certainly have the mysteries. But they have built-in safeguards, like the fact that you can't touch the high priest, I think is quite important. And I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalist. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. Stay in touch with us because it's a crucial thing. You know, we're right in the heart, as I like to point out, of this media crackdown. We have incredible shows coming up for October and November. You don't want to miss it. Get on board, subscribe to the show, get behind it, get behind the work that we're doing here. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to take a few more questions, and then we'll wrap up tonight's show. And I want to remind everyone that next week we're coming back on Friday at a normal time, and we're doing a show on Rata and his Atlantis background. But then the Saturday show is going to be at 6 p.m. a week from tomorrow. And that show is going to be on the time capsule, mystery, and the Georgia Guidestones.
That is going to be a great show. Okay.
We've got something. We have a pretty big bombshell. Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a few more questions. There's great people out there. Gaia Sophia is out there. I see a cult fan.
Ice Angel is back.
Hey.
Nice to see Ice Angel.
A cult priestess. And, you know, everyone's asking such fantastic questions. And what's great about that is it takes the level of conversation up, and which is what we need to do over and over again when we address this information. There's so much static, there's so much noise out there, you know, whether it's this ridiculous Kavanaugh charade and all the junk that everyone's throwing at each other. I mean, they all have so much mud to throw at each other, and we just get caught in the middle, and God knows what they're doing in the background while all that's going on. But here we have, you know, people, and it's kind of the intention is very different, which is, you know, I want to get this information out to you, and I want you to be able to work with it. I want to kind of share those keys that I've discovered as a journalist. And I wouldn't present it as anything else. I'm a dark journalist, but I'm a journalist. I'm giving you that information so that you can weigh these things out and that you can look into these traditions, the mystery traditions, which are right under our, you know, right before our eyes. And they're here. Anthroposophy, theosophy, the Gurdjieff movement, the Casey work. They've set up so much, and they've been glossed over by a lot of marketing junk and intelligence chicanery, shall we say. So what we have to do is kind of reclaim that wisdom and knowledge and try to figure out what the legacy is that they've given us of this incredible esoteric understanding. Okay.
So Titan Blooded also wanted to know, what was the Dogon's impression of these beings? You know, were they friendly?
Well, I mean, the master of speech went out, you know, and she got blasted right through the forehead. And what's interesting is when she was blasted, the stones where she fell grew this very unusual plant, and it became the same kind of story as the mistletoe story. So, and there's a couple of books that cover this and really try to get into that aspect of what that meeting was about. So what I'll do is I'll include, you know, in addition to the books I've mentioned here, I'll include a couple of links to those when we put the video up tomorrow. And okay, fantastic. Okay. But yes, it is in terms of how they engage them. First of all, I think that the frenzy that the Dogon get into is excitement on one hand, but it's also they have to whip themselves into a kind of a state of fear when they put on the stilts, because when they wear the X masks, they're going directly and engaging with the Nomu, who are super normal beings, whether you think of them as initiates or as if you think of them as gods or aliens. They're super normal. And, you know, whoever engaged with them, it might have been a kind of an unpredictable experience to get that information, but they worship them. There's no question about it. And they see them as benevolent. Yes.
So BV wants to know, what do you think of Farsight remote viewers? One talks about communing with ET, who states that they can travel through hyperdimensional network of connected stars, maybe our sun through Sirius?
Well, look, there have been really amazing remote viewers like Ingo Swann. Joseph McMoneagle is still with us, and he's remarkable.
Would love to interview him.
I did a great show with Russell Targ, who worked at SRI and created that whole program. And it was actually Ingo Swann who coined the term remote viewing. And it became a CIA psychic program where they would get these people to tune into certain things to help rescue ambassadors, to try to spy on Russia, whatever it happened to be. So the program was real, and they certainly did it. And then afterwards, people using remote viewing, any kind of psychic work and psychic experiment that rolls the ball forward, I'm all for. In terms of those particular experiments, I've run across a few things related to those things. Haven't seen anything that has blown me away, but maybe some people know that material better. For some reason, I'm not getting such great information back on the remote viewing side in the public. I don't think we're seeing a lot of fantastic remote viewing, probably because all the good remote viewing is going on in private in a sense. But remote viewing is absolutely real, as is psychic experience. And, you know, the way that we understand and the way we move forward in our understanding of all these things relating to the political situation, our own history, the nature of reality, you know, factoring that in, really makes an enormous difference. So, you know, absolutely more power to the remote viewers.
Okay. So Phase Templar, are the Numo still in our oceans, and do they control that domain? And Niall Obstat says Oannes came from the sea and the UFOs are still based underwater. That's their lair. Also Lake Michigan, they are underground and underwater. What do you think?
Wow. Well, what's interesting is I just mentioned Joe McMoneagle, and Olivia, there was a UFO Hunters.
It was the one they got in trouble for. They got canceled for that episode.
Yeah. What was the name of the base? You remember it began with an A?
Oh, God, I can't remember.
But that is an interesting thing. Off the coast of Cuba there, McMoneagle did a remote viewing. He was actually working on a government project, and on the side, he did a remote viewing for Bill Burns, who was doing a UFO Hunter show at the time, and he saw craft operating underground there, kind of close to the Bermuda Triangle. So I absolutely think there's a number of things still operating, and I emphasized the mystery traditions when I was working on this, because I know everyone, when they look at the Dogon, they go immediately to the ET aspect. But I thought maybe we'd give it a little bit of balance. But there's no question that there's off-world civilization interference, relating to the UFO file. And that aspect is huge. There's no question about it. But yeah, in terms of the oceans, it's funny you mentioned it, because the name, the Nomu, means watcher or monitor. And they associated it with monitoring the water. But in fact, they came out of the water. So watching, monitoring is pretty interesting. We know the Enoch tradition of the Watchers. So there's a crossover. There's definitely a crossover here. I think, again, we've got two different aspects. You've got advanced beings, and then you have this off-world culture. And there seems to be a lot of confusion about who's who. I often bring up the Casey reading where he talks about Ezekiel, and they say, can you describe for us what the Atlantean crafts look like? Just give us a kind of a blow-by-blow. And he said, well, they were like Ezekiel described at a much later date. And we know Ezekiel sees those wheels within a wheel. And so, but there's a lot of questions there, which is, why would the Atlantean technology be something Ezekiel would be seeing 10,000 years later. And why would he be mistaking it for God when it's an Atlantean device? Fascinating question. Okay.
Could you spell pneumo for people?
It's
Or-
Nommo.
Okay.
So it's actually Namo. That's not O at the end for some. They say Namo.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I've seen. Okay.
Okay.
Last couple of questions.
All right. So Bill Ferry wanted to know, do you know about Louis Spence's book on Atlantis, The Occult Sciences of Atlantis?
Yes, I'm familiar with Spence.
And do you have anything to say about that?
I think he's one of those people who moved the paradigm forward. So you have a number of books about Atlantis. Ignatius Donnelly is the breakthrough book. Ignatius Donnelly was he was going to be vice president when he put out this, he was from Minnesota, and he put out this book about these antediluvian cultures and these links in Atlantis. And then this is all around like when Blavatsky comes out, so if you're looking for mystery school ties on the political end, there you go. I still think the best information put out about Atlantis is from the Edgar Cayce readings. Bingo.
Okay. Najat is just dying to know the answer to this question. So if secret knowledge held by mystery schools are naturally the right of humanity, then what gives them the right to hold it for themselves? Damn it.
Well, no, they've earned the level of personal sacrifice to be able to arrive at the knowledge. So not hiding anything. They are, as opposed to secrecy that's for advantage, they keep truths. They're guardians of truth from falling into corporate raider hands like the Davos crowd who could manipulate everyone with it. I'd refer you directly to Helena Blavatsky's comments on this about why the mystery schools keep the deeper esoteric secrets, because they're mostly concerned, just like with the atomic bomb, like look what happens when we get our hands on those toys. Okay, one more question.
One more question. There's so many good ones left. So
Hey, we're coming back for 2 episodes.
Giovanni Delgado says, what does DJ make out of the recent Planet X headlines?
They're getting very far. They're going to have to announce it. They've been trying to switch out the terminology to Planet 9, but it's not going to work. And I do feel like something fascinating is coming forward there that's going to show forward that these people who've been looking at the Planet X question were right, just like the cultures who maintained it were correct. So, wow, it's also fascinating. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it, Olivia.
Let me throw one last question at you. So we have a couple people asking about Manly P. Hall and what you think about the quality of his teachings and whether you would recommend his books.
Of course. Secret teaching of all ages is fundamental. He understood the nature of those groups, and he's obviously a deep initiate in the work. And it seems like the information he shared freely over decades, it actually cost him a lot of problems in his life, sharing that kind of information. And very often people will say, he's a Mason and all this kind of thing. Well, first of all, Masons get access to incredible information. But second of all, he didn't live his life as a Mason. He was granted the Masonic rite because of his work after, the fact. So he wasn't sort of sworn into that. But the other thing is, I don't think we understand the mystery traditions of the Masons so well, and they often turn out being scapegoats. Just like whenever you see a group being used as a scapegoat, and this applies to racial groups or groups having to do with like the Masons, their traditions over long periods of time, we have to be careful, because what happens is those very things are used to obscure the facts. So if they can divide you, if I'm an Israeli and I'm a Palestinian, and if I can get you in the middle of that on one side or the other, then I can mix you all up about what's actually going on. There will always be these different splits when you look at different situations. When you get into you know, the Masons control the world, this group controls the world. You have to be careful because it's not monolithic. There are factors and sectors that control the world. And, you know, that larger picture, I think we all have to look at. But what we see too much of, and what's kind of the easy escape out, is grabbing on and saying, well, this group does everything. You know, they're all negative. Let's go all in against the Masons, you know. Not to say that there aren't some dicey things that the Masons haven't been involved in, but the thing is, when you look at the Masons and you look at the Pope and the Church prosecuting the Masons and the whole, you know, burning the Templars, just like the witches get burned later. I mean, these are battles, intramural battles. And when we get to that point, I think, you know, it gets very hard to see who the good guys and who the bad guys are. What's happening is people are vying for power and vying for position. So I'd like to keep a very open mind when it comes to it, and then, you know, be more specific to when a group steps out of line, when a movement steps out of line, like when manipulated by the media, for example. We get into political situations. It's very obvious to see groups manipulating that. That is much easier to call out than just saying, you know, that one group over there are Illuminati or something. That doesn't wash for me. It's also interesting, and one thing I want to point out about Masons is they have two versions. One of the versions is in the real inner circle, that it represents the history and all the rest of it. And then there's the outer circle, very much like how I described the mystery traditions. You have the mystery school, the lesser schools, these arcane schools, and then the private study groups, and then the public study groups. You know, that's a lot of levels. The people who are in mystery schools versus people studying books on a public level, I mean, the people in the mystery schools are as high above them knowledge-wise as the moon. And what's great is the person studying at the public level has the ability to eventually reach that moon, because if they follow the tradition. So, you know, but I mean, let's get real. Somebody who just picks up and becomes a Mason or becomes involved with a mystery school, that doesn't mean that they know all the ins and outs of it. It takes incredible sacrifice, incredible effort to get into that circle of knowledge. So yeah, I think that it's quite remarkable the way that this works. And we need to understand it and be careful about a kind of jingoism approach when it comes to when we're looking at esoteric information. All right, Olivia, you get one more.
This is, we get this question all the time. I know there's a lot of discussion on the web about this. Free Range Brain is asking, is a great name, is the light after death the gateway to the eighth sphere? Is the light a trap?
Oh, isn't that interesting? No, the light is not a trap. I don't know, whoever said that is completely incorrect. Light, from an astral level, represents higher consciousness, basically. So the eighth sphere, one of the ways I think we can understand the eighth sphere from the Steiner's perspective is simple. The eighth sphere is a fantasy where you don't control the rules. So what it does is it appeals to your desire, it sucks you in, and then when it has you, it can manipulate you. So many people now, you know, we see ourselves being kind of, there's a lot of junk media that gets sort of forced down our throat. We need to create those filters, but a lot of that junk media relates to eighth sphere kind of activity. So I would call it, the best term of the eighth sphere is corrupt imagination, or criminal imagination. So that's maybe a good place to start.
Yeah, I want to share that I had my own near-death experience, and which was sort of textbook. But I want to say that the thing that was shocking about it is that when you move towards the light, what happens is your love expands, and you move towards the light because the joy and the love is what you are following. It's not necessarily the light. It isn't visual. It is the emotion, which is so pure, and it's your nature to go back to the more love. And so if something happens and you are you're going through the tunnel, just follow the love. Don't worry about following the light, just follow the love and you'll be fine.
Isn't that interesting? Well, see, that's Olivia really going on that feeling thing. And that that agrees very much with the shaman tradition. What I want to say too, we've been talking about these groups tonight, from the Laplanders to the Dogon to the Yezidis. And what I want to say about them is simple. These groups are actually to be celebrated by us. And, we should be in incredible awe of the task that they've performed, which is preserving this tradition over thousands of years under incredible persecution. I mean, look at the Yezidis. They are being persecuted by this faceless, strange group, ISIS, and all these horrible things are happening to them, really, because they hold the esoteric track. So, I think our great respect goes to them. And when I think of the Dogon, I think of the incredible tradition of them handing this information down, sacred information about humanity's past and future. And if that's an alien civilization giving it to them, or a god, or an initiate from an Atlantean culture, regardless, the group itself that's maintained the tradition has made a difference, a huge difference. And I have incredible respect for the groups that we've studied tonight. And I always want to include more than we can get in, but I think we did pretty good in 2.5 hours. And I'll invite everyone to come back with us next Friday for the Edgar Cayce Rata reveal of Egypt. And then we will be joined on Friday by Gigi Young. She's coming in to open us up to that really psychic aspect of those things, and that psychic account on the Akashic Record. On Saturday, we're doing this time capsule special, and it's a mind blower. That's a week from Saturday. Those shows will be back to back, and it's going to be incredible. That's episode 30 of the X series, part 1 and 2. Remember to go to darkjournalist.com, and what you really want to do is sign up there. Most of the information, we're really going to be putting out a lot of stuff for October. And what I'm working on are these X dialogues with guests. And that's probably something at first we're going to offer just for subscribers. And thank you, subscribers, for getting behind us. You've been terrific people who are getting behind the show. It makes a huge difference. And, it is amazing, because when we looked at this and we started off with the female shamans, and you look at all these incredible traditions that come out, like Morgan and the whole Eringo Bra and the Tua de Danann, which we covered in September. It's an incredible expanse that's waiting there in going inward and really applying that in the culture that we're in. And the culture being degraded, there's always that term, which is don't leave the world will leave you. And that's the thought I'm going to leave you with tonight. Certainly the Dogon applied this theorem, and it worked out really well for them.
Yeah, and we had some people asking if you were going to include the Maori at some point, or some other groups, indigenous groups. And there's many cultures to compare and contrast, for upcoming episodes.
Well, look, I'm somebody who was reading Eliade books in my teens, so the understanding of cultures and those shamanic traditions is something that I enjoy so much. And it's so in the heart of the X series with the X Steganography and the stuff that we're doing here. When we get into these mysteries, I think we create also new corridors of information, all of us together, not just me here giving you the information.
Yeah, I also personally feel that with all this transhumanism that we're coming up against, that we may disagree on minor things, but I think we can all agree that this is a nightmare. And what did you find out about CERN today, that about the density?
Yeah, I'll report more on this on Friday, next week. But there are now major scientists warning about the possibility of CERN flattening the area that it's in, and really kind of collapsing the density. So it's getting serious. It's definitely getting serious. CERN is a big problem. It's going to be a big focus going forward. By the way, we're going to have amazing shows coming up for October, and some incredible surprise guests, and some that you know very well, and we've really been dying to have back. So thank you so much for being with us. We will see you next week. And Olivia, you get the last word.
I say chocolate chip cheesecake ice cream, and right away.
Listen, that's a great idea. I can't imagine a better. Did you get that in the vision, or is?
I've been planning it for a while.
Well, it's interesting. I think you've inspired a following here. Let's head on over. Thank you, everyone. Fantastic crowd. Great. Now everyone's getting into the chocolate chip. We will see you next week. And it's been great being with you. And stay safe. And we'll talk soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Chocolate chip, huh?
Chocolate cheesecake.